My name is Rok Spruk. I am an associate professor of economics at the School of Economics and Business, University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. My lecture this afternoon was about the drive towards the empirical credibility revolution in multidisciplinary social sciences. I tried to discuss the trade-offs that are confronted daily by the empirical social scientists, how to appropriately navigate between the perils and promises in the environment characterized by increasingly larger data sets and increasingly larger samples that capture multiple dimensions of human and social behavior. I tried to discuss how to implement some of the empirical techniques in the appropriate context that have driven the credibility revolution in applied microeconomics. How can we understand if particular public, social, or economic policies ultimately change the course of human behavior, of economic growth, or more other broader social phenomena? We have discussed, or I've tried to discuss, a series of techniques where such credibility can be established, such as regression discontinuity design, difference in differences method, and more recently also the synthetic control method, right? And apart from trying to discuss and provide some background and some necessary conditions upon which these empirical techniques can be applied, I also tried to demonstrate the potentially promising uses of such data. For instance, I tried to apply data-driven counterfactual techniques to study some of the most pressing questions that have evolved in some of the advanced and less advanced countries in recent years. I tried to show how methods such as synthetic control method can be used to understand the long-run effects of populist assaults on judicial independence and on judicial integrity, using the case of Turkey and the takeover of power by the AKP populist party in 2010 and onwards. We also tried to show that sometimes big data can provide interesting patterns, but it may also provide misleading insights, and as such cannot act as a substitute for a more careful and clever and credibility-driven statistical analysis, where researchers and scholars are better able to disentangle cause and the effect, causes and consequences, right? And I have tried to explain this and also demonstrate some of my own research, where I have been trying to use not necessarily very big, but moderately sized data sets trying to address some of the most pressing policy relevant questions. For instance, it is a well-known fact that in many Western countries, beginning in the 1990s, life expectancy and public health has generally deteriorated, especially among white middle-aged men, and that this trend has been particularly strong after the COVID-19 pandemic. We tried to show that sometimes governments have adopted way too lenient approach to the multinational corporations. For instance, the entry of many multinational companies, especially fast food franchises, has generally been associated with a notable slowdown in the improvement of life expectancy, notably slower reduction in the risk of infant mortality, and even more importantly, has contributed significantly to the ongoing and problematic obesity pandemic in the West, which of course has very high economic and public health costs. The question was then, of course, how can these empirical findings add to the policy relevant discussion? What can actually governments do that private initiative or some private entrepreneurial initiative do not undermine massive and important gains in public health, which many governments have invested in for decades, right? We also try to show later on during the lectures what is the overall effect, or I should say the consequence, of the populist takeover of power. For example, once populists come to power, it is a well-known fact that they usually attack two important segments of the society. One is the civil society and another one is the judiciary, both of which act as a deterrent against opportunistic and sometimes predatory behavior of governments. And we have tried to show using the credibility revolution tools like synthetic control method, difference in differences method, that it may take very small amount of time and a short amount of time that populist politicians destroy the institutional fabric and judicial independence. Yet it may take many decades before institutional trust is revived and somehow recuperated. Sometimes, of course, we are, as human beings, inclined to seek more optimistic answers, right? And to deploy empirical analysis that tries to seek positive and optimistic policy implications. So if we ask ourselves, what can we do, right, to redress and improve, to address some of the public health concerns posited by excessive fast food consumption that many fast food companies were able to penetrate and deliberately misinform and mislead consumers. We have also tried to show less optimistic cases and less optimistic contexts where credibility revolution tools can be used. For example, unfortunately, it has become very common to use such tools to understand the economic and human development effects of civil wars, which of course have ravaged not only the West, but not only the Western societies through the war in Ukraine, but many societies outside the West. One can think of Yemen, Gaza, Eritrea, Ethiopia, right? Myanmar recently. And such tools can be used to better understand human development consequences of civil wars. For example, using the synthetic control method in one of the research papers I've published with my co-authors, we have shown that the civil war in Syria has led to our estimate is around 4,000, 5,000 additional infant deaths that occurred during the bombardment of hospitals in Damascus, Aleppo, and other cities in Syria. These tools, of course, have the potential to uncover tragic and horrible effects of civil wars and armed conflict. And yet, our question and our mission is to ask, what can we do, not only as social scientists, as academics, but also as citizens, right, to ensure and facilitate a recovery of war-torn societies that's as rapid as possible. And this does not only include infrastructural recovery, but also the recovery of trust in institutions, which once it disappears, it can be only hardly established. Now, the empirical methods that I have discussed during the lecture have the potential to measure the effects of such shocks, whether it is civil war, whether it is populism, or whether there are regulatory reforms or regulatory changes very precisely, right? And also to highlight what policies should be deployed, right, in order to break the chain of unfortunate persistence. So if we try to focus on more recent examples, how can countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, like Hungary, how can they recover after years of populist mismanagement, after years of populist assaults on the civil society and judicial independence? Is there a way out? Now, these tools that I have tried to discuss show the potential for such applications. Now, of course, the road and the mission is far from complete, but hopefully one day we will be able to not only use and better understand the effects of civil wars and armed conflict on human developments, but also better envision and deploy the necessary policy measures to overcome the tragic effects, right? Whether this is civil war or whether there are also public health effects. For example, it's a well-known fact that in the United States, life expectancy and other public health outcomes are on the stage of consistent decline that has been particularly strong after COVID-19 pandemic. What can governments do to improve public health capacity? What can governments do to improve human health? Is the libertarian paternalism the right answer? Or should governments adopt a more, let's say, traditionally continental European approach and be more proactive in terms of the regulation? Now, some of my colleagues argue that the way or the path of libertarian paternalism, where governments do their due diligence by appropriately informing the citizens of their action, is the right way. But there are negative externalities associated with the private initiative. Fast food companies, right, for example, have found numerous strategies to evade and bypass not only licensing requirements, but also information provision tools, right? And sometimes, of course, markets fail, right? But instead of having, let's say, a more ad hoc, a more ideological discussion about the merits and mismerits of free markets, right? I think the empirical tools that drove credibility revolution have the potential to unravel and show what policies work and achieve the intended effective results, and more importantly, which policies do not achieve such effects. Now, as a society, this is of course what we have to understand, because we are confronted with numerous challenges. How to appropriately address the issue of youth inclusion in the labor market. Is the economic model or the business model in the gig economy, where there are many so-called on-request initiatives and platforms such as Uber, such as Lyft, such as anything else. Maybe they are consumer friendly, and very flexible, but at the same time, these models, are putting millions of workers and in the gig economy at the risk of vulnerable employment, right? Which of course may only exacerbate with the increasing age and become more pressing and more daunting and even more problematic. Now, with the empirical tools that I discussed during the lecture, such as regression discontinuity, design difference and differences, even a series of propensity scores and nearest neighbor matching estimator, we are better able to understand the effects and what kind of effects can emerge. How do these policies affect the appropriate outcomes in the labor market and beyond, and what kind of implications they have for human welfare, longevity, and development. And I think that maybe one day we will be basically a step closer, right, to finding the most appropriate and best course of action that would improve the welfare, not only of the developed countries, right, but also of the human civilization in general.